All right, praising God for the reality that even though it's going to cost us a lot to follow him, he basically gives us through Jesus a parable that says, count the cost of following God. There are times when he still delivers us from the worst of it. And so praising God for those moments, let's look at a relatively famous chapter, Daniel chapter 6. It talks about Daniel in the lion's den in a chapter we want to call math or bad math, understanding that I want to tell the story from the perspective of a few numbers. First of all, King Darius, now having taken over from, I think it's Belshazzar, either way, Nebuchadnezzar's son, the king of Babylon. He is now going to have 120 satraps. I don't know exactly what that means, but they are rulers or authorities in his kingdom, the kingdom of the Medes, which will eventually become the Medo-Persian kingdom. Either way, over those 120 satraps, there are 3 presidents, they are called in the ESV, of which Daniel is one. However, Daniel is to be appointed over all of them or head over them all, a familiar position that he's seen himself in before, understanding that he impressed King Nebuchadnezzar, at least to that degree as well, understanding that he was appointed head over the wise men in the kingdom and over the province of Babylon. However, of those officials, that one Daniel is going to produce many haters or many who are interested in finding fault with him. However, they are unable to find fault with Daniel, but they are able to find fault with his loyalty to God, understanding that as loyal as he is proven to be to the king, he is even more loyal to God, more loyal to God. And for that reason, they go into the king with a side deal through a side conversation that persuades him to make what do they call it? It's not a law, an injunction that anyone who decides they are going to appeal to any god or authority other than the king for the next 30 days is to be thrown into the lion's den, leading to the more famous part of the story where the king, having his ego appealed to, makes the decree, but soon regrets it, understanding that, oh yeah, there's that Daniel guy who worships the God of heaven, and in spite of the decree, he is not going to be willing to compromise his loyalty to God. And so after the decree is issued, it can't be taken back. The satraps or the officials have basically trapped the king, understanding that this kingdom has basically a standard of law that goes even above the king's authority. And so the king has gotten himself into a trap where Daniel now has to be punished for refusing to pray to or appeal to the king only and not to God for that 30 days. And so, of course, Daniel, being loyal to God, gets himself thrown into the lion's den, but the consequences still seem to touch the king's heart as the king is not able to sleep during the night. Daniel is tossed into the lion's den. And so it seems that early the next morning, he rushes to the lion's den, hoping that the God to whom Daniel prayed has indeed saved him, which he has. Daniel being pulled out of the lion's den is going to be replaced by those who conspired to throw him in. And not only them, but as one of our brothers pointed out on Wednesday, them and their entire families. They are thrown into the lion's den in Daniel's place, at which point Daniel now has another king who has had an encounter with God significant enough for him to praise God too. Reminding me that King Darius, finally reaching the right conclusion or right answer about God, seemed to travel through a whole lot of bad math. First and foremost, side conversations, especially those that tend to take more the tenor of gossip, are a great way to do bad math. Why is that? Well, the second kind of bad math they're doing in this situation, it's not only a side conversation, but is one that consciously leaves out at least one person who might have valuable input. Understanding that in leaving Daniel out, it's probably going to make it more easy for them to get their way. But another portion of bad math that they do is failing to properly count up what it really means to get their way. Finally, it seems that in replacing Daniel in the equation, they add in an appeal to the king's ego, understanding that if the king were in his normal functioning level of common sense, just common sense, he would know that if he is about to promote Daniel as the best or greatest of the counselors in his kingdom, it might make sense to include him in the decision. However, appeals to our ego can numb common sense. And so in this situation where Daniel is noticeably absent, when they're appealing to the king's ego, it might put his common sense to sleep. The good thing is the king eventually comes to the right conclusion, because this is one of those situations in which God steps in to essentially save not only Daniel, but in a lot of ways, the king from himself, having made a decision that would basically cost him one of his best advisors. The king, now realizing what had happened, all of those counselors who conspired against Daniel didn't properly calculate how little the king would want to continue to have people with that kind of character continuing in his service. Understanding that, as we've said before, the king had the privilege of divine intervention in this circumstance in life. The reality is we don't often get the benefit of divine intervention to save us from ourselves, reminding us once again what we talked about in the last chapter, the importance of practicing wisdom so that we are not found lacking in situations where we are tempted to do bad math.